Hey everybody, Shannon Scott with Grave Talks, yet again coming to you from the St. Louis Cemetery in Louisville, Kentucky. And it is the cemetery of angels and anchors, as I'm calling it. Just stunning place. But, you know, inside of Catholicism, there's heavy imagery about Christ, you know, as the shepherd overlooking the flock, let's say the lambs. And within these cemeteries where there's so many children buried, you find ornate graves, ornate headstones, many of them, you know, buried without headstones. That was also tradition, just to protect people's kind of feelings and emotions. But inside of the St. Louis Cemetery is the story of one child that honestly was like the JonBenét Ramsey story of Louisville. And of course, you and I are now well familiar with these stories of children that get used as commerce, ritualistic sacrifice, people heavily involved in the occult, that have great positions of power. And she's buried not far from this concentric circle full of the, let's say, shepherds. These are all the priests and the bishops and the monsignors and many other figures in the religious world of Catholicism around Kentucky and maybe lower Indiana, other places, I don't know, but they're almost there at the front entrance. And, you know, not casting aspersion on them, but, you know, one child here for sure went, I think, unprotected and really received no justice or very little. And it's a complex story, like JonBenét Ramsey. Her name was Alma Kellner, and she is buried here dead at 8. She dies in 1909. Her sister Minnie, who also died young at 16 years of age, buried neighboring of some disease. She was pretty sick, I think, for most of her life. But nonetheless, her mother and father here in the foreground. We have Fred Kellner, who is his own case of intrigue, and Florence, or Flo Kellner, who died in 1961, so many years after they lost their children. Dad also lived a fairly long life. But anyway, let's see where to begin. Alma, or rather, the young girl child, Alma Kellner, Alma, she vanished in 1909. Her mother and father started attending a different church, St. John's Catholic Church, and there was a different start time for the morning mass. I think, I can't recall if they'd been accustomed to attending one at 9:45 or something like that. I mean, you're welcome to research the details, but the point is, it was not unusual, or so it was said, for little Alma to attend mass by herself, even though she was a very young child. I would assume the church not terribly far away. And anyway, she vanishes in, I think it was December of 1909. And, you know, an initial investigation about the child's disappearance, Dad, Fred, really was reticent. Mom was panicked. Dad was strangely unconcerned. He basically just had this conviction that Alma would return, and, you know, you could make the argument he was trying to be strong for his wife or, you know, whatever. But it does become a little suspicious throughout with Fred. Her body, in fact, I think it was the newspapers, in the way they took hold of the story, really dramatized things and made the investigation more complicated for the officials by just manufacturing things to sell newspapers. And I don't remember all the details, but it was just sort of sensationalism in the papers. We're not surprised, right? And ultimately, there was a plumber named Joseph Wendell, I would just say was quite a character. He had a reputation of just kind of up and running. He was sort of an interloper, that would decide that he had had enough of, life in that town, that job, his marriage, and he would just vacate premises. But he didn't make himself less suspicious by doing all this. He was originally from France, but the basement of St. John's had flooded, and he went down there and basically discovered almost highly brutalized body. I mean, her skull had been crushed in. She had been essayed. Again, an 8-year-old child or 7-year-old child, 8-year-old. Many of her ribs on one side of her body were completely broken. So this was a child who'd been tortured and more. Now, I will say that Joseph Wendell, he was responsible for the lost and found. And what made him kind of a suspect too, and this again could just be completely coincidental, but he had found Alma's shoes and reposited them first in the lost and found. So this was a part of the evidence trail, but it looks like he'd found the shoes somewhere else in the church, right? So the killer may have left them somewhere and Joseph didn't think anything about it. Now, we'll also add that Alma's body had been set on fire. I think it was near the furnace. I don't remember if they found her in the furnace, but someone attempted to burn the body beyond recognition. Now, Joseph, in this preliminary hour, decides to up and vanish. Later, he would tell authorities that he left his wife because she had lied about her age and was not as young as she had stated. And, again, he kept vanishing, and it didn't make him look any less guilty. But they ended up catching up with him in San Francisco. Well, he was in Texas for a while working at a dude ranch, and he found out that the authorities were tracking him. He makes an escape out to San Francisco, and on July 31st of 1910, they capture him. There was no evidence, by the way, to really support Joseph being the killer, except his, sort of odd nature of dropping out and going on the run, which, that invokes the cynic in all of us. But really, there was no evidence to say he'd done this cruel thing to young Alma. But he was tried for it. He was convicted. They fought for the death penalty, but he was given 25 years with the possibility of parole. And when that did come up later in his life, interestingly, Alma's father and maybe mother were present in the interview about the victim's sort of statement to the parole board, and they thought he should be released. So I thought that was interesting. In the end, however, there was a priest named Hans Schmidt, an interesting character, I believe, originally from New York. He ultimately had been, I think he'd been convicted, or he had actually murdered his pregnant girlfriend in New York, and ultimately had been found to have visited St. John's Church in Louisville, Kentucky, or St. John's Catholic Church, around the time of Alma's actual killing. And the way he had murdered his pregnant girlfriend in his own lifetime fit the actual schematic or the nature of the injuries against Alma. So, put two and two together, it sounds like it was this guy. Now, if I have this correct, and I could be off, but there is a factuality about this. When Alma's father, Fred, was interviewed on the stand, and I can't remember if this was during Joseph's trial or Hans's trial. I'm going to lean towards Hans's trial. But it's like he had some sort of internal guilt where when pressed, he said he just kept going back in an unusual way in a response level that he felt. He kept making the announcement, I guess, to the prosecution or whichever attorney, that he felt bad that his daughter had been buried without any religious service. And it was hard to tell in between the lines whether this was a thing he was struggling with, like she didn't end up maybe in the promised land or have access to heaven because of that, or was it almost like, I don't want to say a boast, but it's like he was in conflict in himself, and he just kept mentioning this on the stand, that his daughter had been buried without any kind of religious service, which is also, in my mind, strange for the Catholic Church and the cemetery idea of that. So what's all that about? I think we really have to legitimately look at Fred and who he might have known, what he became witness to, who he was in cahoots with. Again, I don't know the reality, totality there. That's hard to say. Again, this is just speculative on my part. So, I mean, again, no judgment here in a shadowy idea. But I think, as we put these facts together, there's just something about Alma's father and the notation that she was buried without religious service. That speaks to something, especially within the world of like a ritual power idea. And, maybe even contrary to some of the Catholicism stuff. This is interesting too. So yeah, I think somewhat in these centrifugal circles, they had taller monuments at one time in the early hours, but replaced them with beautiful trees like this. So anyway, that is the strange case. And by the way, Hans Schmidt, not to pass up on that, Hans Schmidt was put to death by electric chair in Sing Sing, New York, or the Sing Sing prison there in New York. I think that was 1914. He was electrocuted. And of course, everybody that had been brought into a speculation as a suspect all denied it vehemently that they had anything to do with it. Maybe that's the case. Maybe it's not. But Hans Schmidt paid the ultimate price. According to history, Joseph Wendling there, or Wendell, sorry if I've got that wrong. I can't remember which it is. Hey, it's a rooster. Laughing at my comedy. But nonetheless, he apparently was a model prisoner, except one escaped attempt, but we know how Joseph was in his life, poor guy. But he was a model prisoner, no real issues while in jail for 25 years. And he went back to France and died there, and apparently was a beloved figure in the community. So doesn't sound like it was our janitor. Sounds like it was Hans Schmidt. But what did Dad know? What did Dad have to do with it? Was he just an ineffective dad? Could be something like that, just a failed characteristic in himself to, kind of grieve properly or console his wife properly. I mean, lots of ways to look at it. But guys, what a case for Alma Kellner in Louisville, Kentucky, buried here in a very kind of almost nonchalant grave not far from the Shepherd's Circle here of St. Louis Cemetery. But anyway, never dull. And I hope you guys enjoyed learning a little bit about her. Her pictures exist online, lots of writing and works about the cases. But we're about to hit the road, head off to Illinois next, and we'll hopefully send some good stuff from there in the coming days. So again, thanks for your support. Thanks for watching.